Hi, everybody. This is Craig from the University of Applied Research and Development, and it is our privilege and honour to have with us Dana Goward, who is the president of Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation. Good morning, Dana.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Great to have you here. I'd love for you to just share with our students and those that are watching the recording how you came to be involved in PNT and GPS and all these amazing things that I'd like to learn about today.
Well, thank you. And I'm flattered that you all would find this interesting. So my background is as a helicopter pilot, primarily for the United States Coast Guard. So during the course of this discussion, we'll be using short words and small sentences necessarily. But after I graduated from that, I became a staff officer and for the U.S. Coast Guard. And when I retired from uniform, the service was kind enough to hire me back as a civilian employee. And in the course of those assignments, I became the Maritime Navigation Authority for the United States. Not only buoys and lighthouses, but regulating bridges to make sure they were tall enough for ships to get underneath. Rules of the road, so ships and boats didn't bump into each other more than they absolutely had to. And coastal and offshore planning, that sort of thing. And of course, electronic navigation systems were a part and parcel of that. So when I retired from that position, there was one hanging chad, if you will, one unexecuted mandate from over 40 years of public service, and that was a requirement from the president in 2004 of the U.S. To have a backup system for GPS, which we almost had, but we disestablished for a number of very bad bureaucratic reasons. And so a former assistant secretary of the Air Force and I, since it didn't seem as though the government was going to be living up to its promises to do the right thing, decided to form a nonprofit, a scientific and educational charity, in order to inform the public and encourage leaders to develop systems and policies to protect GPS signals and users. Subsequent to that, I was appointed to the President's National Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Timing Advisory Board, and I also served on Space Command's Purposeful Interference Response Team, but have been doing this with a small stipend, but essentially pro bono as a continuation of public service for the last 8 years.
Thank you. I'm just becoming familiar with the terminology. So can you just dig into a little bit positioning, navigation, and timing?
Sure. Well, most folks are familiar with GPS. I mean, it's what shows up on your cell phone, and sometimes in your car navigation systems helps you find your way from point A to point B. Often with the addition of software and crowdsourcing information, it will help you find the most efficient way from point A to point B. But GPS is really just a series of satellites that are highly precise clocks that are orbiting the Earth. And of course, they have their counterparts, the Russian, Chinese, and European counterparts in terms of their satellite constellations. But all of these satellites are just highly precise clocks. In fact, there are 3 highly precise clocks on each one. And what they provide is really the kind of thing that everybody needs. It's called positioning, navigation, and timing. That is the service. So as with a lot of things, most people don't care about how it gets there as long as they have the service. And so we refer generally to position, navigation, and timing as the requirement. So positioning clearly is important. You need to know where you are. Navigation, something that the computer in your cell phone or navigation device uses positioning and maps to enable. But timing is really the critical piece there. As I mentioned, they're highly precise clocks, and they all transmit a timing signal simultaneously. And when that timing signal gets to your cell phone or other device, it that your device measures the difference in time of arrival and says, well, I know they were transmitting it all at the same time, but because I got it at a slightly different time here from there, it's able to determine in 3 dimensions where you are. So not only is timing fundamental to navigation, but it's also fundamental to a whole variety of things in terms of cell phone synchronization, digital broadcast, and other essential services that we take for granted.
So in a situation where there's a natural disaster or an emergency and cell phone towers are down, are people able to still use GPS, or is that only through the cell towers they can use it?
Oh no, yes. So cell towers and wireless systems will supplement GPS, but the basic service arrives free from the sky, and it supports cell towers and such. Now, if GPS was to go away, then cell towers and other services would degrade because they depend on it. That's the relationship there. GPS is the underlying, or I should say, P&T is the underlying silent utility, if you will.
Okay, so phones get their GPS signal directly from a satellite rather than through a cell tower?
They do, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you led the creation of the national and international anti-piracy standards and the national plan to achieve maritime domain awareness. Why don't you tell us about that and what it means and the impact of these?
So somewhat separate from my P&T duties and responsibilities, but yes, before I was involved with that quite so much, I was involved with a number of national and international maritime policy issues as the navigation authority for the United States and in other capacities in which I served. So your students and you may recall the Maersk, Alabama, and how it was seized by pirates off the coast of Somalia. That our development of anti-piracy policies and our international work there was based on some very simple and clear directions from President Obama at the time, that won't happen again. Make it so. And it's always difficult to work within government, but it's much easier if you have very clear and direct tasking from the president, because you can turn to all of those who might not be quite so eager to contribute and say, well, look, it's not me, it's the big guy. So that was interesting, and we focused not so much on catching and punishing pirates as preventing the piracy to begin with. Ensuring that ships transiting those kinds of waters, and in fact transiting all waters, because we're aware of and took the needed precautions so that it would be much more difficult for pirates to board them and interfere with their operations. That included any number of best practices from which were codified both nationally and internationally, from maintaining best speed to having fire hoses posted at the appropriate times, and in some instances having the option to carry an armed security team, which was not as easy as it might seem, because every nation the ship calls at has different rules and regulations for how weapons can be brought into or out of the country. In some instances, we determined it was simpler for the ship to, before it picked up the pilot to enter a country, to just throw all the weapons overboard, because it was just too difficult to carry them in and out. In other instances, we developed procedures where they would be locked and secured. But yeah, that was a very interesting experience, working not only with industry and across the interagency and interdepartment process in the United States, but also with the United Nations, the International Maritime Organization, and gaining consensus and agreement and documentation of what the best practices were and should be. And since that time, we were able to greatly reduced the instances of piracy off the coast of Somalia, and we also were successful in carrying out the president's mandate with no more U.S. ships being pirated. So the National Plan for Maritime Domain Awareness was a little bit different. That preceded the anti-piracy effort. We after 9/11, there were significant concerns that the maritime borders of the United States were essentially open, and to some degree, all maritime borders are. It's very difficult to secure long stretches of coastline, large coast exclusive economic zones.
Yeah.
But there was a sense that 9/11 was somewhat of an intelligence failure, and also that the intelligence community had the way they deliver products and services was not serving everyday maritime security forces. So typically an intelligence alert would be very specific, and it would not include a whole lot of background, whereas most folks on patrol want to know about everything that's out there and kind of make their own judgments and use their own experience and local knowledge to say, well, this is an anomaly and this isn't, right? But they weren't getting that with maritime intelligence, and some folks didn't have a lot of security forces didn't have access to maritime intelligence because it's very much a classified kind of thing in most instances. So we began in the U.S. Coast Guard what we called maritime domain awareness. So just understanding what's out there. I think our motto was see, understand, and share. Right. So the idea was to get as much unclassified information about the domain to as many of the good guys as possible, and let them take it and use their own authorities, their own experience, and their own resources to do what's in the best interest of the nation. So the national plan to achieve maritime domain awareness was kind of the high level piece of that, and kind of set the tone. Basically documented a lot of things that had already been underway.
Sorry, what was that phrase you said? See, understand,
and share.
And share. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned when you're dealing with all these different agencies and the United Nations and other countries setting up the anti-piracy, you said to achieve consensus and commitment. When that didn't happen, how did you approach that, and could you give us an example?
Well, so that's a good question, because you tend to have a little bit of post-traumatic stress, for some of these things, and just not try to remember the hard parts and focus on the success. But certainly there were things, especially. And I don't recall how this turned out, but certainly at the United Nations, the issue of armed security teams was very contentious, and there was a desire to not do that. So in those kinds of venues, United Nations, everything is based on consensus. The consensus of the folks who are members and who are sovereign nation states, right? So. The things that didn't make it into the overall best practices were certainly available for individual member states to adopt and include in their own best practice, right? So we did that, and at some level, especially with information being as freely available as it is, folks can cross-check and see what other nations are doing, and sort of perhaps adhere to the international best practices and requirements, if you will, and then add on other requirements or procedures that they see as appropriate for themselves.
So you leveraged existing laws or regulations to help get through the objections of certain groups. Is that what you're saying?
Well. So we what we did. So each nation had their own approach, and
Mm,
we sort of selected from everybody things that we could agree on. But we didn't say just because everybody's not going to agree on that, you can't do it on your own, right?
right.
So yeah, so there's a basic international core of here's what you really need to do, and then if you as a flag state, for example, so in maritime there's flag states, the the states that really exercise sovereignty over a ship, right? The flag that the ship flies, and then there are port states. So uh, the nations that have the ports that the ships are coming to, right? So ships have to obey both their flag states rules, and then when they're going to a port, they certainly have to obey the port states rules, right? So using those kinds of authorities, we were able to, and then there's the international standards that everybody agrees upon. So with the combination of the three, it was pretty easy to get a reasonable regime in place that substantially reduced the ease with which piracy could be carried out.
So, for those of people who will watch a recording and they're from other nations, tell us about the US Coast Guard and the size and the type of activities. You were a captain in the Coast Guard, weren't you?
I was, yes. So the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, is an interesting organization. It is supposedly commercial equivalent would be a large holding company of maritime interest, because there are 11 different statutory missions, and they range from everything from enforcement of fisheries laws to anti-smuggling, search and rescue, regulation of the maritime industry, inspection of merchant vessels, and it goes on and on. So at the same time, even though it has a relatively large portfolio and is spread naturally, as you can imagine, across the entire United States, including the Western rivers, where aids to navigation and other concerns, industry regulation takes place, and in offices around the world for liaison and our international relations. We're still smaller than the New York City Police Department in terms of the number of active duty folks. So it tends to be a very interesting career with a lot of different opportunities, even if you spend most of your time in the cockpit. After you I like to say graduate, but age out would be probably better, more accurate term. Even after you can't fly anymore and do all the or don't have the opportunity to fly anymore and do all the exciting hands-on things, there's still a wide variety of things to get involved with.
I'd love to hear from you, for you to share some leadership experiences you had as a captain in the Coast Guard that were kind of formative leadership experiences.
So it's again, and I had been thinking about that in preparation for this, and it is it's difficult to say, because the fish don't realize that the water's wet, right? So while it's happening to you and you're growing, it's very hard to realize, oh yes, but certainly there are things that one learns from. I think one of my most important leadership lessons that finally dawned on me is that leadership is a duty. It is something that you owe to other people, and which I don't think that a lot of people think of it that way many times. Um, if you when you're we all this is true for all of us, but certainly when you're occupying a position of authority, you have a responsibility to um, encourage and instruct, and when folks get on the wrong path, to set them back on the right path in relatively short order. Because if you don't, then they'll continue to follow the wrong path. And then when they do that, then the failure is not only theirs, it is yours, because you have failed to give them something which you owed them.
That's good.
Yeah. Uh, so whenever I would be a little bit reticent to be involved, or you know, say, well, it will probably be all right. No reason to speak up. I would remind myself, no, this is why you're here.
Mm.
It is sharing your experience and sharing your values, and and helping people do the best that they can, and ensure that they don't stray and go the wrong way, and reflect poorly on themselves and you.
That's really great. I wrote that down. Leadership is a duty owed to other people. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell us about Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation, and what it does and why you set it
Oh,
up?
oh yes. So, well, I may have mentioned that we are actually a scientific and educational charity, which might seem to be an unusual construct. But by doing that, we enable support by commercial entities, but at the same time make ourselves independent of them. And in fact, by the taxation rules in the United States, we are actually prohibited from directly supporting their interests, and they are mandated to support our mission, right? So there's all kinds of nonprofits. Other kinds are like trade associations where you do support your members' interests. But we wanted to provide as much objective opinion and advice to the public and to governmental leadership as we could, and be as independent as we could. So we established it as a charity. And we advocate for policies and systems to protect GPS, and more generally GNSS, which are the other navigation satellite systems, to protect their signals and users, right? So we advocate for toughening individual receivers, protecting the signals from disruption, and providing additional signals, non-space-based signals, and other space-based signals, so that when these global navigation satellite systems are not available, folks will still have the critical PNT back
Mm.
to the beginning that they need to continue on. So we do a lot of educational outreach. We work with the Congress. We work with folks in the administration, and do a lot of writing and this sort of thing, actually.
Mm. Well, just as we wrap up, why don't you share with us, for those that are aspiring to work in the industry that you lead in, what might be some learning experiences they could put in place?
Well, so positioning, navigation, timing, or satellite navigation generally tends to be very a technical field. We are a little bit of an anomaly because we focus on policy issues. And I would say that the niche that we occupy is the interface between technology and policy. And so I would advise folks that it's not necessary to have a real deep technical knowledge in order to get into this area, but you have to be able to speak intelligently about it. So while you don't have to perhaps design a rocket or a satellite, you certainly need to be able to know what's involved with doing so,
Right.
and how they perform, right? So a good foundational basis in terms of engineering and science. And then for the policy piece, it would be social science and individual and social psychology, because that's what politics is. It's just another name for it. Interesting intersection, because the one is very linear, very rational, certainly difficult and complicated, but it has solvable problems in the real world that obey real world physical laws. On the other hand, politics and psychology are nonlinear, not necessarily rational, and involve perhaps even more complex interactions and factors, many of which are exceptionally difficult to identify and almost impossible to quantify. So
Hmm.
so if folks are interested in the technology policy world, I would start with a good foundation in technology and science and engineering, and then dive into to the policy bit. Because once you're over in the policy world, it will suck you in like a black hole, and you only occasionally look back into and finally remember the halcyon days of when things really made sense and you could solve it on your calculator.
Well, Dana Goward, President of Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation, really thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and your experiences. You are appreciated.
It's my pleasure, Dr. Hansen. Thank you.
For those of you who are watching the recording or hearing about this, if you're interested in getting a bachelor or a master's in emergency response and risk management, right now we're redeveloping our program. So do reach out to us on uard.org or uard.ac.nz and join us in the new way of making sure that higher education is accessible for anyone, anytime, anywhere, and probably due to PNT. So thank you, Dana, for being with us.